Hey guys, got a bit of a fluffy video for you today, but someone sent me a mail in-game earlier talking about Glint. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about her, and it really got me thinking about the Guild Wars timeline, the timescales of events occurring, what we have seen of this planet, and just generally when things happen, because I think perspective for a lot of new people coming to the franchise, or a lot of people who don't really spend long looking at the history of Tyria, have a really kind of close idea as to when the Elder Dragons were last rising. So what I thought I'd do was give you guys a brief history of time, and we're going to skip huge chunks as well, just to give you guys a little bit of perspective on what we're dealing with when we talk about the Elder Dragons, and when we talk about things like Glint, and we hear things like Glint is older than the Shiver Peaks themselves. That in itself is a little bit of an interesting topic. The difference in the geography of Tyria between GW1 and GW2 is immense. Far more than you'd ever expect, for example, in the real world. Just a 200-year gap, and we've got these crazy, crazy changes. In fact, before the game came out, I remember there's a lot of discussion, people saying, oh, this is hyper unrealistic. That's fine with me. It's a fantasy world. It's a world filled with magic. I can expect big changes. And just by looking at how much has changed in this short period of time, it really does make it seem very plausible that Glint could have outlived the Shiver Peaks. There is perhaps a counter discussion there, though, that this 250 years has been a particularly turbulent one. We can't actually take this most recent 250 years as the status quo, because these are the 250 years in which the Elder Dragons rose. And that does not happen very frequently at all. So we have the theories and the understanding that the Elder Dragons rise in cycles. This is nothing new, but we've only really heard about two cycles. The one that we're currently in, where they're currently rising, and what the Dermot Priory predicts to be a cycle 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years, what does that mean for Tyria? Whenever you look at a different fantasy work, they'll have a different age for their planet, and there'll be different timescales that you're dealing with. What exactly does that mean for us, players of this game? Well, something quite huge, actually. And that's because all of the lore we really know encompasses a very, very small window. And that's what I really want to talk to you guys about, just to demonstrate. Now, when ArenaNet say stuff like, oh, the fractals can be shown at any point in time, think about the Colossus fractal, okay? This giant guy, we don't know where we are or when we are. This open door they leave themselves is huge. You could say, oh, this happened 6,000 years ago, but to say that something like that happened 6,000 years ago, which is still after the previous Elder Dragon Rising, is to put it in a place in time that we know pretty much nothing about for thousands of years in either direction. And this is why ArenaNet are really open to do a lot of crazy things, and I think it's important we get that perspective. I think it's important, especially for Heart of Thorns, because we are going to get a little bit more elaboration, hopefully, than we did from the initial release of the game, on some of these ancient races that are now supposedly extinct, or, have fallen from grace in the case of the Jotun. So there is a fantastic resource on the wiki. This is largely what's going to be guiding me, though it's not entirely comprehensive. On both the GW1 wiki and the GW2 wiki, we can kind of see key events as we go back in time. So let's get a bit of perspective about what's going on right now. The current year is 1328. That's a number you guys are going to try and get used to. I'm constantly forgetting present day in modern day Tyria. I find it very easy to remember present day in GW1, but not GW2. And that's because what they've done since releasing Living World, they did a little bit of a retcon, where, and some of you guys might not know this, the Tyrian year used to not be the same length of time as the Earth year. And it was kind of one of these cool little inconsistencies between Tyria and Earth that made it feel like more of an alive place. And they actually retconned this. They changed this. They said, oh, people who made those old calendars, I believe they tried to explain it. They just made mistakes or whatever. But really the reason that ArenaNet did this was because then, with their Living World strategy, every day in the real world, when you get up and you go to school or work or whatever you do during your day, and then you come home, that day has also magically passed in Tyria too. Every time we wait a month for another Living World update, what we see those characters of Destiny's Edge 2.0 and whoever doing, it actually canonically is taking place a month later. And there could be a couple of discrepancies there, but they really like doing this one-for-one matchup. So every time a year passes in the real world, a year is passing in Tyria too. That means there's already been a few years in the timeline since Zaitan was defeated. And you can kind of break it down. So the current year is 1328. And that's the present day, the beginning of Heart of Thorns. It will be very late in the year when the event of Heart of Thorns begins, but specifically the destruction of the Pact Fleet occurred this year too, and the rebuilding of LA occurred this year. The Pact Fleet destruction is kind of floating in the timeline right now, as far as I understand, so that when Heart of Thorns releases, it's kind of synced with that. I believe that's the way that they're working it. but LA being rebuilt at least is one big thing that has happened in the timeline this year. Actually, as I go back through some of these years here, you're going to find there's a lot of story, not just on the year that the personal story takes place, but in many of them. And it's funny because right now, 1328 is like the least active in terms of story for the entire frigging franchise for like a long time, just in terms of pure lore. And this is largely due to the fact we've had barely any updates actually go into the game, or the one that we have had have been mechanical things rather than story-based things. So yeah, that's what this year is. Let's rewind the clock. That means at 1327, of course, this was Living World Season 2. This was Destiny's Edge 2.0 going through Dry Top, the Silver Waste. This was everything to do with Belinda's death, to do with Omad's machine and what we saw in there. It was our visits to the Priory Library. It was even the Zephyrite getting shot down and they're being destroyed in Dry Top. All of that stuff in Season 2, that was that year. In addition to that, this year also marks the death of Scarlet Briar, i.e. the very last bits of Season 1 Living World. So this also includes the Battle for Lion's Arch, that huge thing with Lion's Arch. I think the marionette fight counts for this as well, because it was a February update. Triple Trouble Worm, all that stuff, Scarlet's death, the disruption of the ley lines, and the waking up of Morgemoth. That was all in that year, so it was an incredibly busy year. Rewind the clock, and we're kind of in the middle of Scarlet's story here, 1326, and this was when Scarlet was trying to disrupt the ley lines. It was her setting up the probes, it was the attacks on Lion's Arch, and Ellen Keel becoming Counselor. In fact, I'm going to keep saying to you guys attacks on Lion's Arch, and basically Season 1 of the Living World, so with Flame and Frost and all that stuff, that was 1326. And actually, I think of most of you guys listening right now, for many of our contemporary players, we are people that aren't very familiar with that Season 1 story anymore. Maybe we did play it, but we probably don't remember too much about it anymore, or we skipped that entire thing altogether, or we hadn't even started playing the game at that point. So this is probably the most mysterious year where a lot happened and a lot isn't kind of documented. And then we re-roll the clock again to 1325. 1325 was the big one. This was the very important year. This is when Guild Wars 2 actually released. So this year begins with the personal story, though that stuff, you know, grand scheme for a timeline like this where you're detailing everything that happened, like broad strokes around the world, you wouldn't really include small details about, you know, the Char meeting his father and what's going on with him, or what happened to your street rat. So really, you can sum this up as, you know, another attack on Lion's Arch, the attack on Claw Island specifically, and then what led on from that during the personal story. This is also, to me, the big year for Destiny's Edge. Destiny's Edge really do kind of have their own story through the dungeons. This was their whole storyline, and in the end culminated with the death of Zaitan. Beyond all of that, though, too, which is a huge chunk of story, the formation of the Pact, that's tons of stuff. It also actually includes the Mad King returning for Halloween, which we hadn't seen for years and years and years, and which again was another attack on Lion's Arch, sort of, because he destroyed the statue and stuff. And then as well, you had South Sun Cove. And interestingly to me, all the way back here was actually our first introduction to some of these Destiny's Edge 2.0 characters and early threads. This was when Kanak, if you really think about it, Kanak became a thing. Kanak's design was quite different back then, but, you know, this is where his story starts. And, you know, the stuff to do with the Consortium and the South Sun Cove, this is all the way back here. That was that first year. So now it could get kind of interesting for you guys who only follow the lore a little bit more casually. Let's rewind it one more year. So in 1324... this is actually when one of the novels I'm holding in my hand right now, Ghost of Ascalon. This is when that was set. This was the first novel to come out and kind of weans people into what the races are and stuff. It was released before Guild Wars 2 actually came out. So a lot of it's kind of just explaining the state of the world. But this is Ghost of Ascalon, and this is actually the story of a guy called Dougal Keane, an NPC, a rather inconspicuous NPC at that, you can just see hanging around Lion's Arch, who joins an adventuring party to recover the Claw of the Khan-Er. And this, the Claw of the Khan-Er is a great relic which was said to belong to the original great leader of the Char. It has like 4 gems on it, one marked for each of his cubs who went off to form their own legions, and it had been missing for a long time since the Foe Fire. It was last seen in the hands of the Flame Legion, for what it's worth. And, you know, they recovered it from Ascalon and gave it to Smoda in the Black Citadel. Now, before the game came out, we heard that supposedly the Claw could be seen in the Imperator's Core in the Black Citadel, but apparently you can't actually find it in-game anywhere. And the peaceful negotiations that were supposed to come out from, you know, bargaining with this claw between humanity and the Char, who had been at war for so long before this, they're still kind of underway and sort of stalemated. So this is actually a big reason why I think after Heart of Thorns, if we're going to get another race-centric expansion, I'm absolutely expecting to be the Char stuff, because they can't have this weird negotiation plot floating for too much longer, in my opinion. But yeah, so this was a big year too. Just 1 year before the game came out. Obviously, we never got to play that stuff. Then you can rewind the clock only a little more. Just 4 years earlier, we have another novel, and that was Destiny's Edge. And this explains the big iconic characters Zodja, Air, Logan, Ritlock, and so forth. And this year specifically, 4 years before Ghost of Ascalon, this is when Snaf died, when Glint died, as we've been talking about this week, when Kralkatorrik rose. Up until this point, Kralkatorrik wasn't even there. Kralkatorrik, before Morgemoth, was the most recent Elder Dragon to have risen and did a lot of damage. All the events of that novel took place right there. And interestingly, this is something I found really cool looking into the timeline a bit closer with more contemporary living world information at my side. It's kind of cool that this is the same year that the Zephyrites kind of went to Glint's body and collected the egg and got the egg from, you know, E. You know, we hear a lot about E right now. You know, he's a big mystery and so forth, but you can trace him back quite a long time before even the launch of the game. He's influencing the story and is still a big influence right now. I was really happy to actually see that in retrospect. A year before this year, we actually have the coming together of Destiny's Edge still being detailed in the same novel this is. But what that means, guys, is Logan and Ritlock, you know, the total bros, the iconic bros of the franchise, or all these guys that we hear so much about, they met almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago. You know, well, once Heart of Thorns comes out, just after Christmas, it's almost 10 years ago that those characters met each other, and it kind of makes them seem more like veterans of the battlefield to me, to think about them like a decade ago that really this stuff started, rather than, you know, all fresh-faced. And then that makes it seem a little bit better that we've got like Destiny's Edge 2.0 taking the spotlight as well now. I don't know, so that was an interesting bit of perspective. There's still tons of story packed around this area of the timelines, okay? 3 years before this was when Queen Jenna became the Queen of Crater. Obviously, there was a long dynasty before that. What you might not know that's quite interesting is she wasn't actually old enough to be queen when the previous king, like, passed. And so actually there was a period of time where the ministry were the ones ruling Crater, and they were doing it in her stead while she, like, waited to mature to become queen. And this kind of sets up some reason why the ministry, you know, they had to give it up so begrudgingly, because they were in charge of Divinity's Reach for a while, and I presume they thought they were doing a pretty good job. So Jenna is pretty new as well, you know, even as a queen. Finally, we start to get some bigger gaps, and this is where I'll stop going so intent with recent history. You know, you've got 14 years earlier, it's described that this is when the Sylvari were born. That doesn't mean nothing happened between those 14 years. We know, of course, then that pretty much all of the Sylvari history slots into that 14-year gap. You've got the founding of the Nightmare Court and Cadian's questioning of the Pale Tree. You've got Foulane then ultimately taking control of it. You've got Foulane and Case' entire relationship, and they're ending up breaking up, including the story we saw in Season 2 as well with Wynn. So remember these flashbacks we saw? That's this gap we're now looking at. You've then also got the story with Rhiannon and Caladbolg and Mazdark, and all these Sylvari bits of history and story, they kind of all slot in here. And then you kind of start getting bigger leaps. You've got 32 years before that, and you've got the Quaggan and the Crate supposedly appearing. That said, there's still a lot of story we can touch on for many, many years. There's a whole other novel that comes shortly before this, which covers a big time range. This is the story of Cobia Mariner and the rebuilding of a previous destruction of Lion's Arch with the tidal wave, with the rising of Zaitan. And that takes us all the way back to, you know, around 100 years ago now, back down to 1219 after the Exodus of the Gods. Then you go further back and you're looking at, like, the rising of Jormag, and the Norn's flight south, and the chipping off of one of his teeth, and the founding of Holbrak. Now that might start sounding like ancient history to you guys, but the current guy in charge of Holbrak, it was only his grandfather that actually founded the place. You know, it was only his grandfather, and that could be because, you know, Norn are very long-lived. Yes, I appreciate that, but we're still not too far away. You've got Palawa Joko around this time as well, taking control in Elona of Vabi, Istan, and Corner, and becoming like their demented leader. And we haven't heard anything about that continent since that point. Now, at this point, we've covered a lot of history, a lot of events, and a whole ton of stuff I've just skimmed over. This is only about a period of 200 years. You might think that it then starts to get kind of thin on the ground, but it doesn't. See, a little bit bit earlier than that, and we're deep in Guild Wars 1 stuff. And obviously, Guild Wars 1 didn't just cover Tyria, it covered Cantha and Alona too. So you have this whole other slew of information from about 250 years ago that, of course, covers the events of the original game. You know, the latest stuff on this timeline, so we're talking about the year 1080 AE right now. And what a lot of you guys might not realize, actually, especially those of you who didn't play Guild Wars 1, is Guild Wars 1 kind of had its own version of the Living World 2. On that long break while we were waiting for Guild Wars 2, they released what they were kind of calling the fourth campaign, or the second expansion, I suppose, which was Guild Wars Beyond, and these were free updates that went specifically into the game around Kryta and around some stuff in Cantha to do with the Ministry of Purity, and Cantha eventually becoming like xenophobic. There was a planned one for Alona too, which would have dealt a little bit more with Palawa Joko, but John Stummy and some of the other guys that were making it, I think, eventually just moved off to do Guild Wars 2 stuff, and we had the release of Guild Wars 2 instead, and that never kind of came till the light of day. In fact, when people ask about Guild Wars 1 updates, mostly I think a lot of them still are looking out for that last Guild Wars 1 Beyond chapter. But yeah, so there's a whole ton more story here. Around this time, obviously, we're looking at the first of the Elder Dragons, Primordus, to have woken up. And though he didn't specifically wake up here, he woke up a few years after the events of Guild Wars 1. His initial stirrings, the descent of the dwarves, the abandonment of the dwarves for Guild Wars 1's sake, okay? We did know some of these ancient races. Some of these ancient races, and really the main topic of this video is about that ancient world. We had some interaction with them. We had interaction with the Massart. We had a tiny bit of interaction with the Seers. We had plenty of interaction with the Forgotten, but the Dwarves too. The Dwarves were one of these ancient races, and this is their descent into the depths. Slowly, from this point on, at the very end of Guild Wars 1, they became less and less seen on the surface until, we meet just one in all of Guild Wars 2, Ogden Stonehealer. So here's another interesting thing for you guys. Actually, the events of Guild Wars 1 span a period of about 8 years, from the year 1072 to the year 1080. And that's kind of an interesting number to me to look at, because for Guild Wars 2, after Heart of Thorns releases, and this Christmas passes in a matter of months now, it's actually going to be Guild Wars 2's done half of that legway already. Guild Wars 1 spanned, these 8 years, and we will have been 4 years through, like, timeline-wise, lore-wise, on the second game as well. And that's kind of curious. I'm not going to linger particularly on, the specifics of what happened in GW1. That would just become a video about that. But then again, you get kind of a 10-year period or longer before the events of GW1, where there's even more interesting story. This is the actual Guild Wars themselves occurring. And it's going to be split across 3 continents, so you can hear about the Corsair Wars, and you can hear about the various emperors and the Tengu Wars specifically going on in Cantha. And then history starts to get more faded. Suddenly we get big gaps. The Great Northern Wall, this huge fortification we see in Ascalon still to this day that the Char couldn't entirely pull down. It was not worth the effort. So they just kind of built around it and on it and put graffiti on it and stuff. That was erected only about 200 years before the events of Guild Wars 1, so we're looking at the same kind of gap between GW1 and GW2. That was also the same time that the Jade Wind occurred, and all this stuff happened with Shiro, and he originally became an envoy. Roll back just a little earlier than that, and you have the very first humans entering the Mists, entering the Rift, the existence of Lord Odrin. And around this time too, just 25 years before Lord Odrin did that, you have Mad King Thorn for being alive, an actual king in Kryta. More big gaps, and the next big prominent thing we see is Kryta becoming an independent nation. That actually, this is very interesting to me. The game is slightly too early for it to work out, I think. Unless Guild Wars 2 is running for a long time, since real-time runs parallel with game time now. But Kryta became an independent nation in the year 358 AE. It's currently the year 1328. So in 30 years exactly, Kryta will be 1,000 years old. If Guild Wars 2 was still having stuff go on in 30 years real-world time, in theory, or they did something to, like, push the plot forward somehow, skip a couple of years like they did with the Searing, that's actually a story we could see come about, What if the destruction of Kryta and humanity in general, they're this aged race that are falling off at the moment kind of thing. What if, the destruction of them is on their 1,000th year anniversary? This as well, this specific time now, this is Glint compiling the Flameseeker prophecies, as we talked about during this week. This is kind of really where I want to stop, and I want to stop here for a very specific reason. We've just gone through almost everything we know lore-wise. Now, a few years before this, about 300 years before Glint made the Flameseeker prophecies, we do start to get the scriptures from humans about the gods, and we hear that the humans were taken to Tyria in the first place. But before this point, really, when we get into this kind of deep time now, over 1,000 years ago, there's very little we know at all. Almost everything we know in this entire franchise is dealing with, you know, about a 1,000-year window, 1,500-year window. And so really try and consider that when suddenly you hear that the last Elder Dragon Rising was 10,000 years ago. 10 times the amount that pretty much all of our story remotely deals with. And the story we've seen has encompassed vast changes, not just in terms of geography, but technology too. Another interesting discussion that's always kind of captured me is you can look at a huge technology difference between Guild Wars 1, where everything was very medieval, and Guild Wars 2, where we have the Char, who have tanks and helicopters and, you know, mechanized firearms. And that's a huge, huge leap. In a really short period of time, there is ample opportunity for so many societies over those 10,000 years, and cultures and peoples to have come from elsewhere and then be wiped out completely, to have all existed in this massive, massive length of time, built themselves up to technological pinnacles, and then collapsed back down again. In fact, one really cool thing to point to is in the Crystal Desert. We hear, right, all this time ago of Glint writing the Flameseeker prophecies, and after she wrote the prophecies, various humans that themselves were quite fresh-faced coming onto Tyria, they fancied themselves as the Ascended, like Chiriosa, and they tried to build up civilizations in the desert, and the desert ended up swallowing them whole. It was really cool. One of my favorite things about the Crystal Desert, and I would hazard I'm not alone about this, is as you walk around there, you see all these old people's ruins. And one of the styles of ruins you could see in Guild Wars 1 is this. Look at this. They're basically skylines, skyscrapers, and modern-day Earth civilizations and cities that have been destroyed and then have left these kinds of buildings in their wake. And that might sound crazy that that kind of thing could have existed, but all you have to do is look at the development of the Char and, you know, just general technology levels in this short window, and that absolutely could have happened as well in any of this deeper time. So, really think about that. Think about when we defeat Zaitan, and for most players it was just, you know, oh, he's the bad guy and we just switch skill 2. This is nothing like when the final boss was just a necromancer human from the first game, or the final boss was a guy like Shiro who had caused a catastrophe 200 years ago. This isn't even like fighting Abaddon at the end of Nightfall, where Abaddon, you know, was ultimately one of the gods who only has been moseying around here for 1,000 years. This is an Elder Dragon that's been here at least 10,000 years ago with the last cycle, and God knows how many previous ones there. That's some serious weight. That's a big thing for us to have killed him in the story, and unfortunately, ArenaNet really don't explain that very well in-game. So think about that. When we get to Heart of Thorns, I would say think about that too. Think about how old really Glint is to have been, you know, created by or influenced by Kralkatorrik during the last Rising 10,000 years ago. Yeah, it's very easy to imagine there were no Shiver Peaks back then. And think as well about the fact that the Forgotten and the Seers, and namely the Massat, who we know we're probably going to be interacting with in the story, they are that old and that ancient. Yes, we interacted with some Massat and they had some presence on Tyria for many, many, many years, even up until Guild Wars 1's times, but these are old races, and these are big timescales we're dealing with. If you hear that Glint has 3,000 years of memories, that is still only a very small fraction of what her entire life was, and all the things that she could have known. So anyway, there you go, guys. Just fancy talking about some lore today, I guess. Let me know what you think if you enjoyed it, and I guess I'll see you tomorrow for whatever else we have on the table. Catch you next time, guys.